Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 ACOM seminar series. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce today Dr. Becky Alexander. She's professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. Becky got her bachelor's in chemistry at Colgate University. She received her master's and PhD in atmospheric chemistry at the University of California in San Diego, La Jolla, with a dissertation on past and present changes in the Earth's oxidation capacity. She was a postdoc fellow at Harvard with Daniel Jacob, where she studied oxidation of atmospheric sulfur. Her recent research has been focusing on many things: marine cloud brightening, heterogeneous NOI chemistry, oxidation capacity of the atmosphere, sulfate chemistry in polluted and pristine environments. And today she will talk about the role of reactive halogens in air pollution and climate. And in particular, she will show how, by using ice core observation, she was able to constrain the anthropogenic emissions of halogens that have a significant role for radiative forcing. She will also make a connection between halogen chemistry and the effects of marine cloud brightening. As a technical note, I'd like to remind you that you can type your question below the screen you're seeing right now. At any time, the questions will be read at the end of the talk, and Becky will answer. And with that, I introduce you to Dr. Becky Alexander. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Alessandro, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. I will be talking about some work that has been done primarily by one of my graduate students, Shuting Zhai, who has been investigating anthropogenic impacts on tropospheric reactive halogens. So I'd also like to begin by acknowledging some other important people in the work that I'll be showing today. First of all, I'll be showing some work using the GeoSchem model. So I'd like to acknowledge what I call the GeoSchem halogen team, which consists mainly of my group at the University of Washington, Matt Evans' group at the University of York, and Daniel Jacobs' group at Harvard. I'd also like to acknowledge my ICE Core colleagues who have sent me some of the data that I will be showing you today, some published data and mostly unpublished data. And finally, funding from the NSF P2C2 Paleoclimate Program. So my talk will be in 3 parts. First, today, I'll be telling you about some observations and model results on the importance of reactive halogen chemistry in the troposphere. The second part will focus on the recent past, looking at ice core observations as a constraint for the model in looking at the anthropogenic impacts on reactive halogen chemistry. That's sort of the core of my talk. And then the third part will be looking in the future, specifically at a geoengineering strategy called Marine Cloud Brightening and its impacts on the atmospheric chemistry-induced radiative forcing. So when we think about reactive halogen chemistry, we typically think about stratospheric chemistry and stratospheric ozone depletion. And if we look at this image of the Antarctic ozone hole, we've known for a while now that in order to get these very low concentrations of ozone, it requires heterogeneous reactions or heterogeneous chemistry on the surface of polar stratospheric clouds. And I point this out because there are some similarities between this and tropospheric chemistry, in particular, the role of heterogeneous chemistry. Reactive halogen chemistry in the troposphere was first recognized to be important in the Arctic. This is a figure by Leonard Berry from 1988, and it shows a time series of observations of ozone and filterable bromide concentrations. And from the ozone plot, you can see that concentrations go from typical background concentrations of around 40 ppb, but can episodically drop down to near zero concentrations in so-called polar ozone depletion events. And these low ozone concentrations are associated with high filterable bromide concentrations, implicating reactive bromine chemistry in these events. This was later confirmed by satellite observations of BRO in both the Arctic and in the Antarctic, where relatively high concentrations, this is the vertical column in the troposphere, were observed in the springtime in both polar regions over first-year sea ice. Later, tropospheric halogens were observed in other parts of the troposphere outside of the polar regions. This is showing some observations from mid-latitudes of iodide and bromine monoxide concentrations, which are on the order of a few ppt. And the bottom plot shows another reactive halogen species, nitrile chloride, that also is typically on the order of a few ppt, but can get as high as several hundred ppt in certain time periods and regions. And finally, reactive halogens have also been observed in the tropics, as shown here. The left shows the diurnal pattern of bromine monoxide and iodine monoxide, showing concentrations near 0 at night, going up to 1 to 3 ppt during the daytime. And other tropospheric reactive halogen species that have been observed here on the right show concentrations of less than 1 ppt. So tropospheric reactive halogens have been observed globally, usually at pretty small concentrations at several ppt, even sub-ppt levels. So how important is this for tropospheric chemistry? So we have been investigating this question using the GS-Chem model. GS-Chem contains comprehensive oxidant aerosol chemistry in the troposphere and in the stratosphere. And importantly, for halogens, includes heterogeneous reactions on sea salt aerosol and in clouds that involves the production and recycling of tropospheric reactive halogens. I've highlighted this in red because this is really critical for the model being able to simulate the observed halogen concentrations. And this is also where a lot of our effort has gone in with the GS-Chem halogen team in developing this part of the chemical mechanism. The model uses assimilated MERA2 meteorology, and the results I'll be showing you today are results from a fairly coarse resolution version of the model at 2 by 2.5 or 4 by 5 degree horizontal resolution. And I'll often be showing you or discussing the halogens in terms of these families, CLY, BRY, and IY. So I've listed the species that make up these 3 halogen families. These are the reactive gas phase species. And I've highlighted in red the most abundant in each family on the global scale. And that's also shown here on the right in this paper in ACPD by Xuan Wang, which shows the global tropospheric annual mean concentrations as a function of altitude. For CLY, sometimes we report the concentrations of CL star, which is just all of the CLY species except for HCl. And this is because HCl is by far the most abundant reactive halogen species, typically concentrations on the order of a few hundred ppt compared to just a few ppt for the other species or even less. And also HCl is the least reactive of this reactive halogen family. So you can see from the figures on the right that the concentrations tend to be highest at the surface in the troposphere and on the order of a few ppt. So where do these tropospheric reactive halogens come from? What accounts for their production in the troposphere? For both CLY and BRY, CLY is shown here, the most important source are chemical reactions on sea salt aerosol. So sea salt aerosol in the atmosphere contains chloride, and acid gases in the atmosphere, such as nitric acid, sulfuric acid, or SO2, can react on the surface and acidify the aerosol and displace the HCl into the gas phase. And this is the largest source of reactive halogens. Other sources include direct emissions from anthropogenic activity, as well as some other chemical reactions. BRY is similar. Its main source is also from heterogeneous reactions on the surface of C-cell aerosols. So C-cell contains bromide and can react with HOBr to release Br2 into the gas phase. This reaction is acid catalyzed, so it only occurs after the C-cell aerosol has become acidified. So acidity is important for both CLY and BRY production. And finally, IY is a bit different than the other two, and that's because iodide is negligible in C-cell aerosol. Its concentrations are significant on the ocean surface. On the right here, you can see both observations and modeling of iodide concentration in the surface ocean. And the relative concentration of iodide and iodate in the ocean is governed by biology. Reactive iodine forms upon ozone deposition to the surface of the ocean that reacts with iodide, releasing reactive halogens into the lower atmosphere. And the main sink of all three of these species is the same through wet and dry deposition to the surface, mainly in the form of their halides or as HBr or HCl, for example. And these species can also be transported in the atmosphere and eventually deposited to the surface of ice sheets such as Greenland, where their records can be preserved in ice cores, giving us some information about past variability. So this is a figure showing the global cycling of tropospheric bromine in the model. So it's pretty complicated, and I'm not going to take you through all of the details. One, I just want you to notice that it's complicated, and also that we have gas phase reactions, photolysis reactions, and heterogeneous chemistry as well. I'd like to point out two other features of reactive bromine chemistry that is the same for the iodide and chloride. One is that some reactions are nonlinear. So for example, this reaction of HOBr with Br minus, so bromide and aerosol to form Br2, takes one reactive bromine and forms two reactive bromine in the form of Br2, because Br2 is easily photolysed to form bromine radicals. Another thing I'd like to point out with this is that the halogens are coupled to one another. So if you see here, we can have species such as bromine chloride or iodine bromine, so BRCl or IBr, which are these dihalogen species. And so the different halogen families are not independent of one another. So this, combined with their nonlinearity and also their fairly complicated chemical mechanism, makes it difficult to easily predict how reactive halogens might respond to a perturbation such as anthropogenic emissions. And it really requires a comprehensive reactive halogen chemical mechanism like we now have in the GS Chem model. So the main features of tropospheric reactive halogen chemistry that I want you to remember are that it involves gas phase, heterogeneous chemistry, and photolysis. Some important recycling reactions are nonlinear and are quite important for maintaining the observed concentrations of some species. And the chemistry of different halogens are coupled to one another. So if you change one, you have an effect on all three. So what we've done is we've looked at what happens to oxidants when we add the tropospheric reactive halogen chemistry to the model. And this is again from Xuan Wang's paper and ACPD. And this is showing the change in OH, NOx, and ozone after adding reactive halogen chemistry to the model. So the top plots show the surface annual mean surface concentrations, and the bottom shows their variability with latitude and altitude. So you can see generally reductions in all three of these oxidants. And the global tropospheric reduction for OH is -4, so a decrease of 4% And for ozone, it's a reduction of on the order of about 10%. In addition to the impact on these oxidants, halogens also serve as oxidants themselves. And these are two examples. One, the chlorine radical is an oxidant. It can react with hydrocarbons like methane and other alkanes, serving as a sink for those species. Also, halogens can be a sink for NOx, mainly through the formation and subsequent hydrolysis of halogen nitrates to form nitrate, which will produce a sink for NOx and is what is responsible for lowering NOx concentrations in the model, as well as impacting ozone and OH. So there's been a sort of pretty extensive comparison of the model with observations in the present day, and many of those are shown in Xuan Wang's paper in ACPD. I'll start with this figure on the left by my student Shuting Zhai. This is a comparison of the model in green with the observations in black. These are satellite observations, so it's showing the tropospheric vertical column abundance. And this goes from the Antarctica, the Antarctic region, all the way up through the tropics to the Arctic. And what you can see here is that the model seems to reproduce, so it needs to underestimate the total abundance, although the satellite observations are quite sensitive to concentrations simulated in the upper troposphere, but in actuality, most of the burden is at the very surface. Also, you can see, though, that the model is able to reproduce the spatial and also the temporal variability, as you can see in the seasonality that is observed and simulated in the polar regions. On the right, just there's one of the many figures comparing the model with observation in Xuan Wang's paper, using two different types of observations, DOAS, differential optical absorption spectroscopy, and SIMS, chemical ionization mass spectrometry, the two most often used instruments for measuring reactive halogens in the troposphere. And you can see the model is sometimes doing okay, sometimes not, depending on the field campaign. One thing I'd like to point out is this figure on the left, which shows that the model does a pretty good job of simulating the observations against some instruments, such as the SIMS instrument here, but does not do a very good job of simulating the observations against DOAS. In other words, in the same region, though at slightly different time periods, the SIMS and the DOAS concentration observations are not in agreement with one another. And the model agrees with one, but not the other. And this does prove to be difficult to assess the model's performance when different sets of observations don't necessarily agree with one another. So a little advertisement here for a field campaign that I am organizing to try to address this issue called BLEACH, Bermuda Boundary Layer Experiment on the Atmospheric Chemistry of Halogens. This is our team here. We'll be measuring halogen concentrations, both aerosol and gas phase concentrations in June of 2022 and January of 2023, using 3 different instruments for measuring the gas phase reactive halogens, where there's some overlap between the species measured, so that we can compare the different instruments with one another. And then we'll also be utilizing the GS Chem model in order to better understand the halogen chemistry that is going on there. So the central part of my talk is to look at this question: how do anthropogenic emissions influence tropospheric reactive halogens? So this is a figure by Tomas Sherwin from 2017, which shows the fractional increase in halogens due to anthropogenic emissions in the GS Chem model. So we have halogen chemistry that's in the model, turn on and off anthropogenic emissions and compare. And what this is showing is that there is an increase in all three of the reactive halogen families driven by the increase in anthropogenic emissions on the order of 20 to 40% over the entire troposphere. And this has implications for the model simulation of ozone concentrations. So this is the showing the column change of tropospheric ozone between the pre-industrial and present day, so PD minus PI. So really, what is the impact of anthropogenic emissions? So without halogen chemistry, this is the tropospheric column abundance of ozone. This is with halogen chemistry, and the right is the difference, all negative values. The burden change is shown in this table down below. And you can see that without halogens, the ozone concentrations or ozone burden is higher than with halogens because halogens act as a sink for ozone. And this has also implications for the radiative forcing of ozone. So what's happening in the model is that the more active halogen chemistry in the present day induced by the anthropogenic emissions acts to dampen the anthropogenic radiative forcing of ozone by 0.08 watts per meter squared. So anthropogenic processes not only increase the sources of ozone by enhanced emissions of its precursors, but also increases the sinks of ozone through enhanced halogen chemistry. So we wanted to look at this result and see if we could have an observational constraint for this in terms of from ice core records. And so I'll be showing you mainly these observations from 6 ice cores here in Greenland, shown here, as well as one from Academy Nook, which is in Russia. And what has been measured are, and I'll be referring to, are the chlorine excess and bromine excess, which you can just think of as the non-sea salt part of chlorine and bromine. And we're equating these roughly to the CLY and BRY in the model. Because iodide concentrations are negligible in sea salt aerosols, we don't do this calculation for iodine, so we just assume that the iodine measured in ice cores is equivalent to the IY simulated in the model. So this shows figures on the left. This is the chlorine excess from 3 of the 6 Greenland ice cores. I'm only showing you 3 because it's difficult to see all 6 at the same time, but they all look the same. And so if you look at the bottom 2, you can see I'm plotting here the chlorine excess and also the acidity measured in the ice core. And so what you can see is that the chlorine excess increased around the year 1940, similar to the time period when acidity increased. And this peaked about the time, the chlorine excess peaked about the time that the acidity peaked and then declined afterwards. Now, of course, the decline in acidity is due to the implementation of air pollution mitigation strategies in North America and in Europe. On the right shows observations of the bromine excess and iodine from that Russian ice core. So we look at the bottom, you can see that the bromine excess, the iodine, and the acidity from this core also show similar trends as I just described in the chlorine excess and the acidity from the Greenland ice cores. So I'm going to focus now on the chlorine records because this is what we've thought a lot more about. This is where we started. And the results of from the bromine and iodine, we're still working on the model analysis of those ice core observations. And so I'll be focusing here on this paper that was published a couple of months ago by Shuting Zhai. So the first thing we did was look at the relationship between the chlorine excess and acidity in the ice cores, since they appeared to have similar trends. And so this is showing, this is splitting up between the 3 higher latitude cores and the 3 lower latitude cores. There were 2 cores at summit, which makes 3, and also splitting up between pre-1940 and post-1940. So before and after the acidity began to increase in the ice core. And what we found from this is that the correlation between chlorine excess and acidity is stronger after 1940 when acidity was higher than before 1940. And also the correlation between chlorine excess and acidity is stronger in the lower latitude cores that are closer to the anthropogenic source regions of Greenland, which is Eastern North America and Western Europe. And so we investigated this more using the GS-Chem model. And we ran 3 simulations using the GS-Chem model in 3 different time periods. First, the pre-industrial period, circa 1750, what we call peak acidity, which is 1975, which was when the acidity concentrations peak in the ice core records. And then the present day simulation is 2007 because that is the top of the ice cores. And what we did was we wanted to focus on the effect of anthropogenic emissions, hypothesizing that the acidity is controlling the variability in the tropospheric reactive chlorine. And so we kept, excuse me, we kept meteorology constant in these simulations and only allowed the anthropogenic emissions to vary according to the year of the simulation. So in other words, sea salt aerosol emissions are not changing in the model. What is changing only, because that's a natural emission, only the anthropogenic emissions are changing. And this shows the results of CLY in the 3 different time periods. The top is showing the abundance, the mixing ratio in the 3 different time periods. And the inset is showing the burden in the region shown here in the troposphere. So what you can see as you go from left to right, as you go forward in time, that the concentrations tend to increase and that the increases are occurring in the continental outflow regions where anthropogenic emissions come into contact with sea salt aerosol. The bottom plots show the difference between the different time periods. So the difference, the increase is shown here on the left in the peak acidity time period, 1975, relative to the pre-industrial. This is the present day relative to the pre-industrial. And then finally, the present day relative to 1975 peak acidity. And the inset is showing the burden just in this inside this green dash line, which is the 5-day back trajectory region for Greenland. And so what you can see is that we have an increase from the pre-industrial to peak acidity, as well as a large scale increase between the pre-industrial and present day. But since 1975, we've had some regions of increase and some regions of decrease depending on anthropogenic emission trends in this region. But in this back trajectory region, we do see a small decrease in the CLY abundance. So we compared these with the ice core record, and that's shown here. This is showing the percent change between these 3 different time periods that I showed previously in the ice core observations in blue and in the GS-Chem in orange. And so what you can first see is that the model is qualitatively consistent with the observed trend, showing increases and mainly decreases in the right times. The model is able to reproduce the magnitude of the increase between the pre-industrial to present day. But when you put the peak acidity time period in the middle, as you have here on the very left and on the very right, you can see that the model is underestimating the change in those time periods. So we looked into what was going on in the model. And this is showing the rate of HCl production, which is most of the CLY, in this back trajectory region. And it's broken up here into its main sources. So let's first talk about the most important source, which is acid displacement, which is the blue. And so what you can see in the model, the acid displacement source is increasing by 29% from the pre-industrial to peak acidity in the back trajectory region. which is what we expected to happen. But unexpectedly, at least at first, there was an increase, a further increase from peak acidity to present day when the acidity was actually decreasing. And so the reason for that is a combination of aerosol pH and aerosol water content. So this is showing aerosol pH. These are violin plots of aerosol pH in the back trajectory region of Greenland in these 3 time periods. And you can see a decrease in aerosol pH of 1.7 pH units from the pre-industrial to peak acidity. And that's really driving the increase that has modeled here. Between peak acidity and present day, though, you see a kind of a small increase in pH. So the direction we expect to go, but much smaller than the decrease that was observed previously, only 0.3 pH units. And this is actually expected because at these low pH values, there's buffering by ammonia so that the aerosol pH doesn't change very much even after the dramatic reductions in SO2 emissions during this time period. Another important parameter for the acid displacement is aerosol water content. The aerosol water content has opposite trends and also opposite effects as aerosol pH. And this is being controlled again by the anthropogenic emissions, by the aerosol content, which then affects the aerosol water content. So the 29% increase is driven by this decreases in aerosol pH. But at low pH values, the partitioning between HCl and chloride is less sensitive to pH and becomes more sensitive then to the aerosol water content. So the decreases in the aerosol water content from peak acidity to present day is what's driving the continued increase in acid displacement of HCl in the latter part of the record. We'll then look at the next source, main source of HCl in the model, and this is direct anthropogenic emissions from coal combustion. So you can see no anthropogenic emissions in the pre-industrial, the highest in peak acidity, and less in the present day. And the SO2 scrubbers that were implemented for air pollution mitigation strategies also remove HCl. And that's what accounts for the decline in the HCl emissions in the model. The way that we simulate the HCl emissions, which are highly uncertain, is that we scale the HCl emissions to SO2 emissions based on present day observations from Lee et al. So basically from one coal-fired power plant plume. So there's a lot of uncertainty with that ratio. Additionally, that ratio may have changed due to, for example, the differing solubilities of SO2 and HCl, which might more effectively remove HCl in the scrubbers compared to SO2. We think that we're underestimating the emissions in the peak acidity because of the scaling due to present day observations, and that actually explains the fact that we get the change quantitatively correct between the PI and the PD, but we underestimate the changes between the PI and PA and PA and PD. And finally, the third source that I'll talk about is the heterogeneous chemical source. This is mostly from N2O5 uptake onto chloride-containing aerosol to form nitrile chloride and nitrate. And so you can see a relatively small but important source in the pre-industrial, increasing in peak acidity and decreasing slightly in the present day. And these trends are consistent with trends in anthropogenic NOx emissions. So in conclusion, ice core observations are consistent with model predictions that tropospheric reactive chlorine has increased due to anthropogenic emissions. These anthropogenic effects are caused not only by changes in acidity due to SO2, but also due to NOx emissions involving heterogeneous chemistry and direct emissions of HCl from anthropogenic activity. And the combined effects of all of these peak around 1975. The ice core observations suggest that there are similar trends in reactive bromine and iodine, also consistent with model, and the model-based interpretation of these records is in progress. And as has been shown before, since reactive halogens impact tropospheric NOx, ozone, and OH, they must be considered when quantifying anthropogenic impacts on the oxidative capacity of the atmosphere. Okay, so I'll now move on to the final and third part of my talk, which is looking into the future. And this is an image, this is a MODIS image of ship tracks off the coast of, off the US West Coast. And so you can see the effect of ship emissions on brightening the clouds over the dark ocean surface. And this is what motivated, oh, sorry, first let me acknowledge the people that did the work that I'm about to show you. Hannah Horowitz is a former postdoc of mine and is now an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, and also Alicia Wright, who was an undergraduate at the University of Washington. So this is a slide from my colleague at the UW, Rob Wood, that explains what marine cloud brightening is. And the idea is to do what ships are already doing, except instead of by brightening clouds by emitting SO2, the proposal is to brighten clouds by emitting sea salt aerosol. So this would lead to more smaller drops, which would increase the cloud albedo. You would need to emit sea salt aerosol at pretty small sizes. And this is just an image of a prototype of a ship that could just go drive around autonomously and spray sea salt aerosol into the atmosphere. So we were curious what this might mean for tropospheric chemistry, given that sea salt is the main source of reactive halogens in the model, or in the atmosphere. So we used the model, GS Chem, the same model that I previously described. And what's important to note here is that it's because it's a chemical transport model, because it uses observed meteorology, including clouds, we don't actually let the clouds vary. So our marine cloud brightening simulations do not actually brighten the clouds. So that is one uncertainty in our calculations and could potentially be important, since recycling of halogens on clouds is important, both as a source and a sink of halogens. The model has natural sea salt emissions that depend on wind speed and temperature, and that are emitted in these two size bins shown here. So what we do in the model is we emit sea salt aerosol for our marine cloud brightening simulation in the existing accumulation mode size bin. It's a bit larger than what is recommended, but it's not actually very different from what was done in the GeoMIP model, the GeoMIP study, the model intercomparison project. We did two MCB scenarios, a low and a high, and we simply took what had been done previously. So we took the, out of the GeoMIP study, we took the lowest emissions and the highest emissions. And we did exactly what they did, which is emit sea salt aerosol in the tropics between 30 degrees north and south latitude, just at a constant flux. So this is showing results of sea salt aerosol concentrations in the model. The top is the standard model without marine cloud brightening, and it looks as you would expect, where you have the highest sea salt aerosol concentrations over the Southern Ocean. And the bottom plot shows the fractional difference, or the factor difference, in our two MCB scenarios, MCB low and MCB high. And you can see that this has a substantial impact on the existing sea salt aerosol concentrations, up to a factor of 40 higher than natural sea salt aerosol emissions in localized areas. You can also see that we're really just emitting them in the model over the tropics, as was done in the GeoMIP studies. So as you might expect, since sea salt aerosol is the largest source of reactive bromine and chlorine, the BRY and CLY increase as a result of this. So here are the BRY and CLY in the standard model on the left. And on the right is showing the fractional difference from our MCB low and MCB high scenario for both reactive halogen families. So you can see that there is an increase in the tropics where sea salt aerosol is emitted, and that's confined to the tropics because the lifetime of reactive halogens is very short. For the global tropospheric change is shown on the right, and you can see it's on the order of 20 to 40% increases, which is a significant increase, and obviously much higher increases up to a factor of 3 locally. So as you might also expect, the ozone in the model, the standard model shown on the left, and the right shows that the ozone decreased in the model. This is the surface concentrations here on the right. And you can also see that although the highest change is in the tropics where we're emitting the sea salt, that the extent of the change goes beyond the tropical regions, and that's just because the lifetime of ozone is longer than the lifetime of reactive halogens. On the right shows the global mean change in tropospheric ozone, which is on the order of a 3 to 6% decrease. And this results in a 2 to 4% decrease in mean tropospheric OH concentrations. And then IY, in contrast to BRY and CLY, decreases in the model. And that is driven by the fact that ozone decreases. So remember that IY forms through deposition of ozone to the ocean surface, less ozone deposition, and less IY production on the order of about 5 to 15%. So we also looked at the change to the formation of inorganic secondary inorganic aerosol, sulfate nitrate ammonium aerosol. So the top is showing the standard model concentration of this inorganic secondary aerosol, and the bottom is showing the change in the MCB scenarios. So you can see that there is an increase in the formation of these inorganic aerosols, and that is dominated by an increase in nitrate formed through the hydrolysis of halogen nitrates. So what we were really interested in was whether there were any significant implications for radiative forcing due to potential changes in the methane lifetime, as well as ozone and the non-sea salt aerosol concentrations. So first, if we look at the impacts on the methane lifetime, the first row shows the modeled lifetime of methane in the standard model and in the 2 MCB scenarios. So you can see that the lifetime of methane increases as you increase the sea salt aerosol emissions, and that's driven by the decrease in OH in the model. So you can see the lifetime against OH is increasing, and that drives the overall increase in the methane lifetime due to the MCB emissions. In contrast to OH, the chlorine radical, which is a very minor sink for methane, the lifetime against the chlorine radical decreases, but the lifetime is so long compared to the lifetime against OH that it really doesn't have much of an effect. And the decrease in ozone and OH causes a 3 to 6% increase in the methane lifetime in the model due to the MCB emissions of sea salt aerosol. So we then did radiative forcing calculations that are described here. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but this is just to give you confidence in our results. The calculations were done using the RRTMG model and also some additional calculations by Chris Holmes at Florida State University. So this is showing first the radiative forcing effect from the sea salt aerosol itself. So this is the direct radiative forcing from the sea salt aerosol emitted for marine cloud brightening. And for the low and the high, the range is on the order of 1 to close to 3 watts per meter squared globally. So this does not include the effect of clouds, of cloud brightening. It's just the direct effect of sea salt aerosol. And so we compared that then with the chemical induced effects. These two here are the effects of the increase in the sulfate nitrate ammonium aerosol and the decrease in ozone. Both of these have a cooling effect, which accounts for the negative numbers here. But notice that the units have changed. Up here, the direct effect has units of watts per meter squared, but now down here, we have units of milliwatts per meter squared. So the cooling effect is tiny compared to the direct cooling effect of the sea salt aerosol itself. There are also some warming effects from marine cloud brightening due to the increase in the methane lifetime, and then effects on ozone and stratospheric water vapor from this increased methane. But the warming effects are also relatively small compared to the direct effects of sea salt aerosol. And if you add all of this up, the net effect is cooling due to these chemistry-induced effects. And the overall effect is on the order of 2% of just the direct forcing from sea salt aerosol. So we can conclude from this, at least with this very first look, that it seems that the chemical effects will be negligible as far as radiative forcing is concerned. There are a lot of uncertainties in the model, and two of, I think, of the most important ones is the sea salt aerosol that we emitted from marine cloud brightening were probably too big, and that impacts the aerosol surface area, which in turn influences the heterogeneous reaction rates and also influences the total mass of sea salt aerosol halogens that are emitted. In addition, we did not actually change the clouds, as I mentioned, and this is important for photolysis rates and also in cloud chemistry, which is a source, represents both sources and sinks of reactive halogens. So in conclusion, looking into the future, we have provided the first estimate of the atmospheric chemistry radiative forcing feedbacks from marine cloud brightening. We calculated net negative forcing, but negligible compared to the direct effect of sea salt aerosol itself. There could be potential air pollution implications, which are local in nature, with decreases in surface ozone up to 25% and increases in inorganic aerosol concentrations on the order of 150% in coastal areas. Another potential air pollution implication that we did not investigate yet is the impacts on mercury deposition, because mercury deposition is also influenced by its reaction with reactive halogens. And this is not purely hypothetical. In a paper published, or an article published in Nature less than a month ago, showed that this is a field trial that the Australians are conducting over the Great Barrier Reef. This is the marine cloud brightening is one thing that they're considering as a way to save the Great Barrier Reef from coral bleaching. They want to use this as a way to cool the surface of the ocean, which does cause these coral bleaching events, and they're already testing this. So our results suggest that the radiative forcing implications, at least from the chemical effect, should be negligible, but the air pollution effect could be significant and may, at least as far as ozone goes, be a benefit. So I put up my conclusions here that I showed earlier at the beginning of my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Becky, for the great talk. It was very interesting. Really enjoyed the time span and the connections between two things that I didn't think they were very connected: geoengineering with marine cloud brightening and halogen chemistry. We already have a question which is great. And I invite everybody to write their questions and upvote if there are multiple questions that you like. Hi, Becky, if you could elaborate a bit on how the acidity of the ice core was measured and what are the technical challenges, such as the unsaturated CO2 in the ice core, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't do the measurements myself. In some of them, it was calculated based on ion balance, and in some of them, it was directly measured. I'm not exactly sure on how it was measured directly, but I think that the absolute value of the acidity that's measured in any way is kind of meaningless because in terms of what it was like in the atmosphere, like how is that, what the acidity in the ice core, how's that related to an aerosol or cloud acidity in the atmosphere? What I think it's indicating are broad scale changes, and in particular in clouds. So I don't think it's representative of changes in aerosol because it's from precipitation. I think that it's representing the acidity of the precipitation more than anything else in Greenland. But it does show the expected trends and gives us some information on the timing of when we did have significant changes in, I think, cloud precipitation pH, essentially. And those are pretty consistent with observations on the ground as well, but maybe just go farther back in time.
I see. I have a curiosity about at which altitude did you emit your your aerosols in your model?
We just emitted them into the boundary layer, so it was the same emission scheme as natural sea salt aerosols.
Okay.
So if that would be maybe another source of uncertainty if the ship emissions were going to be significantly higher than that, which I don't think is the plan.
Yeah.
I think the plan is to emit them close to the surface.
Yeah, I heard some controversy that it's fairly challenging technically to keep those are to emit 100 nanometers first and then keep those sea salt aerosol afloat and not let them sort of immediately bounce back and go lower. That's why I was curious about it.
I think they're actively working on the nozzle in order to make those small particles.
Another curiosity that I have, I'm an experimentalist. So I'm very happy to see that you're organizing a campaign where you're doing some instrument comparison. Are you guys planning to do sort of in-field comparison and some sort of lab comparisons as well, or is it just an intercomparison in the islands?
Yeah, mainly an intercomparison of all three, of reactive halogen species that cover at least something in all three of the reactive halogen families. And there is some overlap of at least one species between at least two different instruments, in some cases between three instruments. So we're hoping to get, one question we have is, it seems that the DOAS observations tend to be higher than the SIMS observations. So we would like to compare those side by side and not in two separate field campaigns to see if that difference is real or not. I think that's really one of that was kind of the primary motivation for me, is that when I saw that these two sets of observations don't agree with one another, how do I assess the model? Like, I can do anything, I have a lot of leeway with the model, but I want to know, what it actually should be. So that was one of the motivations. And then Bermuda is a location where the model predicts that the concentrations are high enough to be above the detection limits for the instrument. A lot of locations it's not. And another reason for going to Bermuda is that due to the Bermuda high, the seasonality of the Bermuda high, you get very different conditions in the summer and winter, where you get clean conditions in the summer and then more pollution traveling from North America over Bermuda in the winter. And that's why we're going in January and June as another way to assess the model prediction that anthropogenic emissions will increase the halogen chemistry.
Yeah, looking forward to the results. It will be interesting. We have another question. Great talk, really enjoyed it. In the second part, you talked about the anthropogenic halogen emission impact on tropospheric ozone column. I was wondering, have you looked at the impact of stratospheric ozone? Thank you.
No. Well, you mean for the, so we have not. I think it will be negligible compared to the CFCs, right? But we have not explicitly looked at that. We do simulate the stratospheric chemistry, but we don't really see any significant changes. Most of the changes are at the surface.
Okay, then we have another question here. It says, Roberts et al. ACP 2014 revisited the Hawks plus X kinetics used in models. They pointed out that the pH dependency is strictly valid for specific pH ranges for HOBR plus BR, blah, blah. And the rate saturates when pH, can you read the question yourself?
I can read the question.
Okay,
yes. Thank you for that question, because yes, we did implement the revisions by Roberts et al. And it had a huge effect. So it was really important that the pH in particular, one, it changed the rate of the reaction, but also in clouds, another thing that's important is that HOBR reacts with both the halides, and it also reacts with dissolved SO2, sulfite, bisulfite. And there's a competition between those two because the reaction rates are so fast in the aqueous phase for those reactions that the rate is limited by gas phase diffusion. And so there is a competition in the aqueous phase between reaction of, say, HOBR or HOCl with the halides and sulfite and bisulfite. And that changed the relative importance of those reactions. And the reason why that's important is because one of them is a source of reactive halogens and one of them is a sink. And so you're changing the balance of sources and sinks. So yes, that change, we were overestimating BRO by quite a bit, and we made that change, and it really fixed it. I mean, I don't want to say fixed because I don't really know what the true value is, but it like halved BRO in the model, just that one change.
Huh, very cool. Yeah, speaking of sinks, and you mentioned that there are some sinks that are related to clouds, and clouds and models are all this topic that is fairly difficult. How careful do you need to be in your model when you treat the sinks? Like how tricky sinks are in the modeling?
Yes, sinks are critical, I mean, for everything, right? But yeah, it was, so kind of the history of the model development is that in some of the earlier GeoChem modeling papers, it didn't actually include the source from sea salt aerosols. It mainly focused on the gas phase and photolysis chemistry, not on the heterogeneous chemistry. And the sea salt aerosol chemistry was kind of as a sensitivity study. And the reason is because when we included that in the model, we had way too much halogens. You know, ozone concentrations would drop really low because the halogens would get so high. And so that was kind of just turned off the heterogeneous chemistry in the model. And so the way that that was fixed was through these sources, these sinks that I previously mentioned. One is that we were originally missing the reaction of HOBr and HOX, in particular HOBr with the dissolved SO2, sulfite and bisulfite in clouds. That was critical for, it's a really important sink, and it's critical for being able to include that halogen, that heterogeneous chemistry that we know is happening, and still be able to simulate the observations. So yeah, the heterogeneous chemistry is important for both the sources and for the sinks of reactive halogens.
Okay, and we have another question. Hi, Becky, thank you for the talk. What is the composition of the sea salt aerosol that are emitted? Will they have health effects as they are introduced in the atmosphere?
So for the first question, it's just seawater. So I don't think it will necessarily be any different than natural sea salt aerosols. Would they have health effects? That's a good question. I'm not an expert in health effects, so I don't know if the sea salt aerosols themselves could be considered a pollutant. My first thought is maybe not. I don't know, is that considered a significant pollutant in coastal regions compared to inland locations? Maybe not.
And probably the interactions with gas phase vapors that will condense on it might do more than the sea.
Yeah, exactly. Sea salt is kind of, because it's alkaline, it's almost like a sponge, and it can actually absorb a lot of other species and then remove them after deposition to the surface. And so you're increasing your aerosol abundance, but you're probably decreasing some gas phase species potentially as well.
Okay, it's 4:32 p.m. and I don't see any more questions. So I'll thank you once more. Thank you so much, Becky, for your great talk. And I thank you everybody who's present that I don't see, but I feel your presence. And see you next time.